In the grand halls of Thornfield Manor, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, no one paid attention to the quiet woman who polished the silver each morning. They never imagined that behind her humble apron lay a mind that could navigate 9 languages with the fluency of a diplomat. But on one fateful autumn day in 1887, when foreign dignitaries arrived with secrets that could topple the Duke's empire, everything would change. The woman they had overlooked would become the very salvation of the realm itself. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The morning mist clung to the towering spires of Thornfield Manor like silk veils, as if the very estate itself wore mourning dress. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the servants' corridors with practiced silence, her worn leather boots making no sound against the cold stone floors. At 23, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that went unnoticed in grand ballrooms. Auburn hair always pinned severely back, intelligent green eyes that observed everything while revealing nothing, and hands that spoke of honest work despite their graceful movements. "Eleanor, mind you don't linger in the Duke's study today," warned Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, her keys jangling like wind chimes as she bustled past. "His Grace is expecting important visitors from the continent. Foreign sorts they are. Best keep your head down and your ears closed." Eleanor nodded respectfully, though inwardly she smiled. If only Mrs. Pemberton knew that those foreign sorts would likely be speaking languages Eleanor understood as clearly as her native English. Her father, God rest his soul, had been a scholar before drink claimed him, and her mother a governess who spoke French like a Parisian. Between them, they had gifted Eleanor with an ear for languages that had only grown sharper through years of secret study in the manor's vast library. The Duke of Thornfield, Reginald Ashworth, was a man whose very presence commanded attention. At 45, his silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes had made him one of England's most eligible widowers, though his heart remained as cold as the marble statues that adorned his estate. His wealth came from shipping routes that stretched across 3 continents, but lately whispers in the servants' hall spoke of troubles, delayed shipments, missing cargo, and creditors who grew increasingly impatient. As Eleanor entered the Duke's private study to dust the mahogany shelves, she couldn't help but notice the scattered papers across his desk. Maps of trade routes, correspondence bearing foreign seals, and what appeared to be contracts written in languages she recognized: German, French, Italian, and what looked like Russian script. Her fingers paused over a letter bearing an ornate seal, the words Consortium European catching her eye. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. Eleanor spun around to find Sterling Blackwood, the Duke's nephew and heir apparent, standing in the doorway. At 30, Sterling possessed the kind of aristocratic handsomeness that had broken hearts across London's finest drawing rooms: golden hair, sharp cheekbones, and an air of entitlement that preceded him into every room. But Eleanor had long ago learned to see past his polished exterior to the calculating coldness beneath. "Forgive me, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, dropping into a curtsy. "I was merely dusting the shelves as instructed." Sterling's grey eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, his expensive cologne failing to mask the scent of last night's brandy. "Dusting, were you? And I suppose you can read those documents you were so carefully examining?" Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I cannot read, sir. I was simply moving them to clean beneath." It was a lie that came easily. Servants who appeared too intelligent often found themselves without positions. Sterling studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. He had always looked at her as if she were something he might purchase, use, and discard at his leisure. "See that you remember your place, girl," he said finally, straightening his silk cravat. Uncle Reginald may be too distracted by his business troubles to notice wandering eyes, but I am not. As Sterling departed, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she resumed her work. She had heard the servants' gossip about the Duke's financial difficulties, but seeing those foreign documents had confirmed her suspicions. Thornfield Manor, for all its grandeur, was built on foundations that were beginning to crack. The great clock in the entrance hall chimed 9 times, its deep bronze notes reverberating through the manor's countless rooms. Soon, the foreign visitors would arrive, and with them, secrets that could determine the fate of everyone who called Thornfield home. Eleanor finished her dusting and made her way toward the servants' stair, but something made her pause at the tall window overlooking the main drive. 3 black carriages were approaching through the morning mist, their wheels crunching over the gravel with ominous precision. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out the occupants, men in dark coats with faces that spoke of serious business. Her heart began to race as she recognized the insignia on the lead carriage's door. What she was about to overhear would change everything, but Eleanor Whitmore had no idea that by day's end she would hold the very survival of Thornfield Manor in her capable, unnoticed hands. The autumn wind howled through the ancient oaks surrounding Thornfield Manor as Eleanor descended to the servants' hall, her mind still racing from the sight of those approaching carriages. The kitchen buzzed with nervous energy as cook prepared an elaborate luncheon, while footmen polished silver with unusual vigor under Mrs. Pemberton's watchful eye. "Mark my words," whispered Sarah, one of the younger maids. "Something's not right about today. His Grace hasn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and Mr. Sterling's been pacing the halls like a caged wolf." Eleanor said nothing, but she had noticed the same signs. The Duke's usual commanding presence had given way to something that looked dangerously close to desperation, while Sterling's arrogance had taken on a sharper, more predatory edge. As she gathered her cleaning supplies, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of the mysterious visitors. Through the narrow servant's window, Eleanor watched as 6 men emerged from the carriages. Their leader, a tall figure with a distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw, moved with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to power. The others flanked him like soldiers, their dark coats billowing in the wind as they approached the manor's grand entrance. "Eleanor," Mrs. Pemberton's sharp voice cut through her observations, "you're to clean the blue drawing-room immediately. And mind you, stay invisible. These gentlemen are not to be disturbed by servants gawking about." The blue drawing-room sat adjacent to the Duke's private study, separated only by a thin wall and a connecting door that was rarely fully closed. As Eleanor began her work, she could hear the murmur of voices growing louder as the visitors were escorted through the manor's corridors. Her heart pounded as she recognized the Duke's voice, strained and formal, greeting his guests in English. "Gentlemen, welcome to Thornfield Manor. I trust your journey from London was comfortable." The response came in heavily accented English from the scarred man. "Comfortable enough, Your Grace, though I fear our business today will be far less pleasant than your hospitality suggests." Eleanor's hands stilled on the crystal decanter she was polishing. The man's accent was unmistakably German, but there was something else, a precision in his pronunciation that spoke of education and authority. As she moved closer to the connecting door, she caught sight of Sterling entering the study, his face a mask of confident charm. "Uncle Reginald," Sterling's voice carried clearly through the thin wall, "surely you're not going to conduct business without your heir present. After all, these matters will soon be my responsibility." A moment of tense silence followed before the Duke replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Sterling, these gentlemen and I have private matters to discuss. Perhaps you might—" "Ah, but Herr Blackwood is precisely whom we wish to meet," interrupted the German visitor. "You see, Your Grace, our consortium has been most interested in the future of Thornfield's shipping empire. Young Mr. Blackwood's reputation precedes him." Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, her cleaning forgotten. Through the crack in the door, she could see the visitors arranged around the Duke's desk like judges at a tribunal. The scarred leader held a leather portfolio, while his companions stood with military precision behind him. "I'm afraid I don't understand," the Duke said, though his voice suggested he understood all too well. The German smiled, but it was the expression of a shark scenting blood. "Allow me to clarify, Your Grace. The Consortium European has been monitoring your shipping routes for some time. We are aware of the irregularities in your cargo manifests, the missing shipments, the falsified documents, the debts that grow larger each month." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected financial troubles, but this sounded like something far more serious, something that could destroy the Duke entirely. "Those are serious accusations," Sterling interjected, his voice smooth as silk. "I hope you have proof to support such claims." "Indeed we do." The German opened his portfolio and spread several documents across the desk. Bills of lading that don't match cargo receipts, insurance claims for shipments that never existed, and most interesting of all, correspondence between certain members of your household and our competitors in Hamburg. The Duke's face had gone ashen, but Sterling's expression remained perfectly composed. Too composed, Eleanor realized with growing horror, as the German continued speaking, switching seamlessly between English and what sounded like French. Eleanor began to understand the true scope of the conspiracy unfolding before her. "The evidence suggests," the visitor continued in French, clearly believing no one present could understand him, "that someone within Thornfield Manor has been selling information about shipping routes to our rivals. Someone with access to private documents and the trust of the Duke himself." Eleanor's blood ran cold as she watched Sterling's reaction, or rather, his complete lack of reaction to words he supposedly couldn't understand. But she could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible nod he gave to one of the other visitors. The Duke, meanwhile, looked genuinely bewildered. "I'm sorry, but I don't speak French. Could you please—" "Of course, Your Grace," the German said, switching back to English. "I was merely commenting to my colleagues on the thoroughness of our investigation. You see, we have reason to believe that someone very close to you has been betraying your business interests for quite some time." "That's impossible," the Duke said firmly. "Everyone in my household has been with me for years. I trust them implicitly." Sterling stepped forward, his hand resting on his uncle's shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of support. "Uncle Reginald, perhaps we should hear what these gentlemen have to say. If there's been some misunderstanding—" "There has been no misunderstanding," the German interrupted. "We have documented proof of treachery, and we are prepared to present it to the authorities unless certain arrangements can be made." Eleanor watched in growing horror as the trap closed around the Duke. The visitors began laying out documents, photographs, and what appeared to be copies of correspondence. With each piece of evidence, the Duke's face grew paler, while Sterling maintained his mask of concerned innocence. But Eleanor could see what the Duke could not. The way Sterling's eyes followed each document, the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth when his uncle wasn't looking, the subtle signals he exchanged with the visitors. This wasn't an investigation. It was a carefully orchestrated coup. "The consortium is prepared to be reasonable," the German continued. "We understand that family loyalty can sometimes cloud judgment. Perhaps if the true culprit were to step forward and make amends, we could avoid involving the authorities." The Duke turned to Sterling, his eyes filled with a desperate hope that made Eleanor's heart ache. "Sterling, you've been handling more of the business correspondence lately. Have you noticed anything unusual? Anyone who might have had access to sensitive information?" Sterling's pause was perfectly timed, his expression shifting from confusion to reluctant understanding to what appeared to be painful realization. "Uncle Reginald, I hate to say this, but there have been some irregularities I've noticed. Small things that I dismissed at the time, but now—" "What kind of irregularities?" the Duke demanded. Well, Sterling said, his voice heavy with feigned reluctance, I've noticed that certain documents have been moved in your study, and there have been times when I've seen servants in areas where they shouldn't be, particularly that cleaning girl, Eleanor, I believe her name is. Eleanor's world tilted on its axis. Through the crack in the door, she could see Sterling's face clearly now, and the cold calculation in his eyes made her stomach turn. He was going to frame her for his own crimes. Eleanor? The Duke repeated, his voice confused. But she's been with us for 3 years. She's never shown any interest in— With respect, Uncle, Sterling interrupted. How well do we really know our servants? And she was in your study this very morning, examining papers on your desk. I caught her myself. The German visitor leaned forward with interest. This servant, she can read? I don't know, the Duke admitted. I've never had occasion to test her literacy. Eleanor's hands were shaking now as she realized the full scope of Sterling's betrayal. He had been selling information to the consortium, probably for months, and now he was prepared to sacrifice her to save himself. Worse, he was manipulating his uncle's trust to do it. Perhaps, the German suggested with a smile that made Eleanor's skin crawl, we should speak with this Eleanor ourselves. A simple conversation might clear up any misunderstandings. Yes, Sterling agreed quickly. I think that would be wise. Shall I have her brought up? As Sterling moved toward the bell pull that would summon a servant, Eleanor realized she had only moments before her world collapsed entirely. The evidence against her would be circumstantial but damning. Her presence in the study, her access to documents, and Sterling's testimony would be enough to destroy her completely. But as she pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing through everything she had just witnessed, Eleanor realized something that Sterling had overlooked in his arrogance. She had understood every word of the conversation, not just the English but the French, the German phrases, and even the few words of Italian that had been exchanged between the visitors. She knew the truth about Sterling's betrayal, and more importantly, she had heard something in the visitors' conversation that even they might not have realized was significant. A name mentioned in passing, a reference to a shipping route that didn't match the official records, and a comment about timing that suggested this entire confrontation was part of a larger plan. The sound of footsteps in the corridor told her that someone was coming to fetch her. In moments, she would be dragged before the Duke and his accusers, branded as a traitor, and likely handed over to the authorities. Her life as she knew it was about to end. But Eleanor Whitmore was not the helpless servant girl that Sterling believed her to be. As the footsteps grew closer, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting to be summoned like a lamb to slaughter, she was going to fight back. The question was, would anyone believe a humble cleaning woman over the Duke's own nephew? The footsteps in the corridor grew louder, but Eleanor's mind worked with crystalline clarity. She had perhaps 30 seconds before discovery, and in that brief window, she made a choice that defied every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. Instead of fleeing or hiding, she stepped boldly through the connecting door into the Duke's study. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, "forgive the intrusion, but I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding." The room fell silent as 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The Duke's face registered shock, Sterling's fury, and the German visitors' calculating interest. Eleanor could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but she kept her chin raised and her gaze direct. "Eleanor," Sterling's voice cracked like a whip, "how dare you enter without permission? This is exactly the kind of presumptuous behavior I was describing." But Eleanor ignored him, focusing instead on the Duke. "Your Grace, I have served in your household for 3 years, with nothing but loyalty and discretion. I would never betray your trust, and I can prove it." The scarred German leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued by this unexpected development. "And how, pray tell, would a simple cleaning woman prove such a thing?" Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but she had committed herself to this course. "Because, sir, I understood every word you spoke in French and in German. And I know that Mr. Sterling understood them as well, despite his pretense otherwise. The silence that followed was deafening. Sterling's face had gone white, then flushed red with rage. This is preposterous. Uncle Reginald, the girl is clearly desperate and making wild accusations. Silence, the Duke commanded, his voice cutting through Sterling's protests. His piercing blue eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see into her very soul. You claim to speak French and German. Among others, Your Grace. My father was a scholar before his difficulties. He taught me that knowledge was the one treasure that could never be stolen. Eleanor's voice softened with memory before strengthening again. When the gentleman said in French that someone with access to your private documents had been selling information to rivals in Hamburg, Mr. Sterling showed no surprise. When they mentioned the correspondence between a household member and competitors, he nodded slightly to the man in the blue coat. The German visitor's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. Your French is quite good for a servant girl, but anyone might learn a few phrases. Eleanor interrupted him, switching to fluent German. Sie sagten auch, dass die Beweise darauf hindeuten, dass jemand sehr nahe am Herzog steht, der seine Geschäftsinteressen seit geraumer Zeit verrät. Sie erwähnten Hamburg 3-mal, und jedes Mal sah Herr Sterling zu dem Mann mit der goldenen Uhr. The effect was electric. The German's eyes widened, and his companions exchanged startled glances. Sterling looked as though he might be sick, while the Duke stared at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. What did she say? The Duke demanded. The German, clearly shaken, translated. She repeated our conversation word for word, including details about Hamburg and observations about Mr. Sterling's reactions that were quite accurate. Eleanor pressed her advantage, switching to Italian as she addressed the man in the blue coat. E lei, signore, ha detto in italiano che il piano doveva essere completato prima della fine del mese, altrimenti il consorzio avrebbe perso la sua opportunità di acquisire le rotte commerciali. The man in question went pale, and Eleanor could see understanding dawn in the Duke's eyes even before the translation came. She says, the German continued reluctantly, that my colleague mentioned in Italian that the plan had to be completed before month's end, or the consortium would lose its opportunity to acquire the shipping routes. The Duke rose slowly from his chair, his face a mask of controlled fury. Acquire my shipping routes. This was never about investigating theft. This was about orchestrating a takeover. Sterling made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. Uncle, surely you can't believe the word of a servant over your own family. A servant, the Duke interrupted coldly, who has just demonstrated more honesty and intelligence than my own nephew. He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, what else did you observe? Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would seal Sterling's fate. Your Grace, I've noticed Mr. Sterling in your study on several occasions when you were away. Last week I saw him copying documents, and when he noticed me, he claimed he was organizing your papers as a surprise. I also observed him meeting with a gentleman in the Rose Garden 3 days ago, a gentleman who bears a strong resemblance to the man in the brown coat standing behind you. All eyes turned to the man in question, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. The German leader's expression had shifted from confident authority to barely concealed anger, as he realized his carefully laid plan was unraveling. This is absurd! Sterling exploded. You're going to take the word of a lying servant girl over a nephew who has been systematically betraying me for months, the Duke finished. A nephew who clearly understands languages he claimed ignorance of? A nephew who showed no surprise at accusations that should have shocked him? The Duke moved to his desk and pulled out a locked drawer, retrieving a small leather journal. I've been keeping my own records, Sterling. Dates when documents went missing, times when sensitive information somehow reached my competitors before it should have. And now that I think about it, they all coincide with your increased involvement in my business affairs. Sterling's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. The debts were crushing us. The shipping business is dying, and these gentlemen offered a way to salvage something from the wreckage. By selling out your own family." The Duke's voice was deadly quiet. "By framing an innocent woman for your crimes." The German leader stood abruptly, clearly recognizing that the situation had turned against them. "Gentlemen, it appears there has been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should withdraw and reconsider." "Oh, I don't think so," the Duke said, moving to block the door. "You see, Miss Whitmore's linguistic abilities have revealed something quite interesting about your investigation. You came here not to expose a traitor, but to complete a conspiracy. And now I'm very curious about the legal implications of that conspiracy." Eleanor watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of relief and terror. She had saved herself from Sterling's frame-up, but she had also thrust herself into the center of a much larger and more dangerous game. The consortium members were clearly not men who accepted defeat gracefully, and Sterling's face promised retribution if he ever had the chance to deliver it. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "if I may suggest, these gentlemen mentioned that their plan had to be completed before month's end. That suggests they have other pressures, other deadlines. Perhaps they are not as powerful as they would have you believe." The Duke's eyes sharpened with interest. "What makes you say that?" Eleanor switched to German, addressing the leader directly. "Weil Sie erwähnten, dass Ihre Investoren ungeduldig werden und dass dies ihre letzte Chance ist, die Kontrolle über die Handelsrouten zu erlangen, bevor ein anderes Konsortium das Angebot übernimmt." The man's face went ashen, and Eleanor knew she had struck home. She turned back to the Duke. "They mentioned that their investors are growing impatient, and that this is their last chance to gain control of the trade routes before another consortium takes over the deal. They're not operating from a position of strength, Your Grace. They're desperate." The Duke smiled for the first time that day, and it was not a pleasant expression. "How very interesting. It seems the hunters have become the hunted." He moved to his desk and pulled the bell cord. "I think it's time to summon the magistrate, and perhaps send word to London about a certain European consortium that seems to be operating outside the bounds of legitimate business." As footsteps approached in response to the Duke's summons, Sterling made one final desperate play. "Eleanor," he said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone, "surely you understand that I was trying to save the family business. We could work together, you and I. Your talents could be very valuable in the right hands." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mr. Sterling, you were willing to destroy an innocent person to save yourself. That tells me everything I need to know about the value of your partnership." The study door opened to admit two footmen, and the Duke's voice rang with authority. "Escort these gentlemen to the blue drawing-room and see that they remain there until the magistrate arrives. As for you, Sterling, you will confine yourself to your chambers until I decide what to do with you." As the conspirators were led away, Sterling shot Eleanor a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed as he passed her. "You may have won today, but you're still just a servant, and servants can be replaced." When the room finally emptied, leaving only Eleanor and the Duke, the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite sure how to cross. The Duke studied her with those penetrating blue eyes, and Eleanor felt as though he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "it appears I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay. You have saved not only my business, but my reputation, and quite possibly my freedom." Eleanor curtsied deeply. "I only did what was right, Your Grace." "What was right?" he repeated thoughtfully, "and what was also extraordinarily brave. Tell me, how many languages do you actually speak?" "9, Your Grace. English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Dutch, and some Latin." The Duke's eyebrows rose. 9 languages. And you've been cleaning my floors for 3 years." He shook his head in amazement. "Miss Whitmore, I believe it's time we discussed a significant change in your circumstances." Eleanor's heart leaped, but she kept her expression composed. "Your Grace, a woman with your abilities is wasted in the servants' hall. I have business interests across Europe, correspondence that requires translation, negotiations that demand linguistic precision. Would you consider accepting a position as my personal secretary and translator?" The offer hung in the air between them like a golden thread, promising a future Eleanor had never dared to imagine. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she couldn't shake the memory of Sterling's parting threat. What new dangers would this elevation bring, and was she truly prepared for the challenges that lay ahead? 3 months had passed since that fateful autumn day, and Eleanor's transformation had been nothing short of remarkable. The Duke's private secretary now occupied a suite of rooms in the manor's east wing, complete with a sitting room that doubled as her office and a library that rivaled those of London's finest universities. Her wardrobe had evolved from rough servant's cloth to elegant day dresses in rich burgundies and deep blues, though she maintained a professional modesty that commanded respect rather than attention. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of her office as Eleanor reviewed correspondence from the Duke's shipping partners across Europe. Her desk, once the Duke's own, was organized with military precision. Letters sorted by language and urgency, translation dictionaries within easy reach, and a leather-bound ledger where she tracked every detail of the Duke's expanding business empire. "Miss Whitmore," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Eleanor looked up to see James Hartwell, the Duke's new business manager, holding a telegram with an expression of barely contained excitement. At 28, James possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that Eleanor had come to appreciate. Brown hair that refused to stay properly combed, warm hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a mind that could navigate complex financial arrangements with remarkable skill. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell," Eleanor replied, setting down her pen. "You look as though you've received interesting news." James stepped into the room, his excitement evident despite his attempt at professional composure. "More than interesting, revolutionary. This telegram is from our contact in Hamburg. It seems the European consortium has collapsed entirely. Their investors withdrew funding after word spread about their irregular business practices." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction. The magistrate's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond Thornfield Manor, and the consortium's downfall had been swift and complete. "And Sterling? Still confined to the London house under his father's supervision," James replied. "Though I hear he's been making inquiries about your background. Nothing actionable, but the Duke thought you should know." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Sterling's hatred had only intensified after his disgrace, and she had no illusions that he would simply accept defeat. But she had learned to navigate more dangerous waters than Sterling Blackwood's wounded pride. "There's something else," James continued, his tone shifting to something more personal. "The Duke has received an invitation to the Pemberton Ball next week. It's to be the social event of the season. Everyone who matters in London society will be there." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And this concerns me how? He wants you to accompany him, as his official translator and business representative." James paused, studying her reaction. "Eleanor, this isn't just about business. The Duke is making a statement by bringing you into society as his equal. It's unprecedented." The implications hit Eleanor like a physical blow. For a woman of her background to appear at such an event, presented as the Duke's business partner rather than his employee, would send shockwaves through London's rigid social hierarchy. It was an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams, and a risk that could destroy everything she had built. "What does His Grace hope to accomplish?" she asked carefully. "Legitimacy," James replied. "The shipping business is changing, Eleanor. The old ways of conducting business through family connections and gentlemen's agreements are giving way to something more professional, more international. The Duke needs partners who can navigate this new world, and your linguistic abilities make you invaluable in ways that traditional society doesn't yet understand. Eleanor rose from her desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds where she had once walked as an invisible servant. "And you think society is ready to accept such a change?" "I think society will accept whatever the Duke of Thornfield chooses to present," James said firmly. "But more importantly, I think you're ready to claim your place in that world." The conviction in his voice made Eleanor turn to study his face. Over the past months, she had come to value James's counsel and friendship, but there was something in his expression now that spoke of deeper feelings carefully held in check. "James," she said softly, "you know as well as I do that my elevation has made enemies. Sterling is only the most obvious. There are others who see my success as a threat to the natural order." "Then perhaps it's time to show them that the natural order is changing," he replied, stepping closer. "Eleanor, you've already proven that intelligence and courage matter more than bloodlines. The Pemberton Ball is your chance to prove it to the world." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention to the window. A magnificent black carriage bearing an unfamiliar coat of arms was approaching the manor, its occupant clearly someone of considerable importance. "Are we expecting visitors?" Eleanor asked. James frowned, consulting his appointment book. "Not according to my records, but that carriage. I recognize those arms. That's Lord Pemberton himself." Eleanor's pulse quickened. Lord Pemberton was one of London's most influential peers, a man whose opinion could make or break social careers. His unexpected arrival could only mean one thing. Word of her elevation had reached the highest circles of society, and the response was coming sooner than expected. They watched as a distinguished gentleman in his 50s emerged from the carriage, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. Even from a distance, his bearing spoke of absolute authority and generations of aristocratic breeding. Behind him stepped a younger man, who made Eleanor's breath catch. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of classical features that belonged in Renaissance paintings. "Who is the younger gentleman?" Eleanor asked. James squinted through the window. "I believe that's Lord Pemberton's son, Viscount Ashford, recently returned from diplomatic service in Vienna, if I recall correctly. They say he speaks half a dozen languages and has been instrumental in negotiating several important trade agreements." Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. A man with diplomatic experience would understand the value of linguistic skills in ways that traditional English society might not, but he would also be acutely aware of social hierarchies and the proper order of things. "Miss Whitmore," came the Duke's voice from the doorway, "I believe we're about to receive some very interesting visitors. Would you join me in the blue drawing room? Your presence may be illuminating." As they made their way through the manor's corridors, Eleanor caught sight of herself in one of the ornate mirrors that lined the walls. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the invisible servant who had once polished these very mirrors. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, her posture spoke of confidence rather than deference, and her green eyes held an intelligence that no longer needed to be hidden. The blue drawing room had been transformed since that terrible day 3 months ago. Where once it had been the scene of conspiracy and betrayal, it now served as the Duke's formal reception room, decorated with artifacts from his global business ventures and portraits of the Thornfield family stretching back centuries. Lord Pemberton and his son were already seated when Eleanor entered, and she could feel their appraising gazes as the Duke made introductions. "Lord Pemberton, Viscount Ashford, may I present Miss Eleanor Whitmore, my personal secretary and chief translator." Lord Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly at the formal introduction, but his son's reaction was more pronounced. Viscount Ashford rose immediately, offering Eleanor a bow that was respectful without being condescending. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of diplomatic training, "your reputation precedes you. I understand you were instrumental in exposing the European Consortium's conspiracy. Eleanor inclined her head gracefully. I merely observed what others chose to overlook, my lord. In 9 languages, I'm told, the Viscount continued, his dark eyes studying her with obvious interest. That's a remarkable accomplishment for anyone, regardless of their background. The emphasis on anyone was subtle but unmistakable, and Eleanor realized she was being tested. Lord Pemberton, meanwhile, had been observing this exchange with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to reading people and situations. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton said, turning to the Duke, I must confess that Miss Whitmore's elevation has caused quite a stir in London society. There are those who question the wisdom of such a dramatic departure from tradition. The Duke's expression hardened slightly. And what is your opinion, my lord? My opinion, Lord Pemberton replied carefully, is that the world is changing, and those who fail to adapt will be left behind. However, change must be managed carefully to avoid unnecessary disruption. Eleanor understood the subtext immediately. Lord Pemberton was not opposed to her advancement in principle, but he was concerned about the social upheaval it might cause. It was a politician's answer, supportive but cautious. Perhaps, Viscount Ashford interjected, Miss Whitmore might demonstrate her abilities. I've brought some correspondence from our embassy in Vienna that has proven challenging to translate accurately. He produced a leather portfolio from which he extracted several documents. Eleanor could see immediately that they were written in German, but the script was formal and diplomatic, filled with the kind of nuanced language that could easily be misinterpreted. These are trade negotiations between Austria and several German states, the Viscount explained. Our current translator has provided versions that seem incomplete. Eleanor accepted the documents and scanned them quickly, her mind automatically parsing the complex diplomatic language. What she saw made her pulse quicken. These weren't just trade negotiations, but discussions of a potential customs union that could dramatically affect British commercial interests. My lord, she said, looking up from the papers, your translator wasn't incomplete. He was deliberately obscuring the true nature of these negotiations. These documents outline plans for a comprehensive trade alliance that would effectively exclude British merchants from several lucrative markets. The Viscount's eyes sharpened with interest. You're certain? Eleanor switched to fluent German, reading aloud a particularly damning passage before translating. They specifically mention reducing English commercial influence and redirecting trade flows away from London. This isn't just about tariffs, it's about economic warfare. Lord Pemberton leaned forward, his political instincts clearly engaged. Miss Whitmore, if your translation is accurate, this information could be vital to British interests. Are you prepared to stake your reputation on this interpretation? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I am, my lord. But more than that, I can provide you with a complete analysis of the linguistic patterns used throughout these documents. The phrasing suggests coordination between parties who are trying to conceal their true intentions from English observers. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Eleanor had not only demonstrated her linguistic abilities, but had uncovered intelligence that could influence British foreign policy. It was exactly the kind of contribution that could legitimize her position in ways that social connections never could. Remarkable, the Viscount murmured, and Eleanor caught something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. His admiration seemed genuine, untainted by the condescension she had learned to expect from men of his class. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton said, rising from his chair, I believe I owe you an apology. I came here today with concerns about Miss Whitmore's suitability for polite society. I leave convinced that society needs more people of her caliber, regardless of their origins. The Duke smiled with obvious satisfaction. Then you'll have no objection to her attendance at your ball next week. On the contrary, Lord Pemberton replied, I insist upon it. Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll allow me to introduce you to several colleagues who would benefit greatly from your expertise. As the visitors prepared to leave, Viscount Ashford lingered for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I hope you'll save me a dance at the ball. I find myself eager to continue our conversation." Eleanor felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of genuine romantic interest from a man who saw her as an intellectual equal. "I would be honored, my lord." After their guests departed, the Duke turned to Eleanor with an expression of profound satisfaction. "My dear Miss Whitmore, I believe you've just secured your place in London society more effectively than any number of formal introductions could have accomplished." Eleanor nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead to the challenges that lay before her. The Pemberton Ball would be her debut in the highest circles of society, but it would also be a battlefield where her enemies would gather to test her resolve. Sterling would undoubtedly be there, along with others who saw her success as a threat to their own positions. The evening would determine whether her transformation from servant to lady was complete, or whether the forces of tradition would find a way to drag her back down. But as she thought of Viscount Ashford's genuine admiration and Lord Pemberton's grudging respect, Eleanor felt a surge of confidence. She had already proven that intelligence and courage could triumph over prejudice and conspiracy. Now it was time to prove that a woman could rewrite the rules of society itself. The week leading up to the Pemberton Ball passed in a whirlwind of preparation that would have seemed impossible to Eleanor just months before. Madame Rousseau, London's most exclusive dressmaker, had been summoned to Thornfield Manor to create what she declared would be a gown worthy of making history. The result was a masterpiece in midnight blue silk that complemented Eleanor's auburn hair and green eyes, while maintaining the sophisticated elegance befitting her new position. But it was not the gown that occupied Eleanor's thoughts as her carriage rolled through the gaslit streets of London toward Lord Pemberton's magnificent Mayfair mansion. It was the leather portfolio beside her, containing translations of additional diplomatic correspondence that Viscount Ashford had requested. The documents revealed an even more complex web of European alliances than she had initially suspected, and their implications for British trade were staggering. "You're unusually quiet this evening," observed the Duke, who sat across from her in the carriage's plush interior. At 55, Reginald Ashworth had never looked more distinguished, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight and his evening clothes impeccably tailored. But Eleanor could see the tension around his eyes. Tonight was as much a test for him as it was for her. "I'm considering the evening ahead," Eleanor replied honestly. "Lord Pemberton's support is encouraging, but there will be others present who view my elevation as a personal affront to the natural order." The Duke's expression hardened slightly. "Let them come. You've proven your worth through intelligence and courage, not accident of birth. That should count for something in civilized society." Eleanor smiled at his optimism, but she had learned to be more realistic about the forces arrayed against change. "Your Grace, civilization often has very little to do with what passes for civilized society." "Urid," as their carriage joined the long line of vehicles approaching Pemberton House, Eleanor could see the mansion blazing with light, its windows revealing glimpses of London's elite gathering for what promised to be the social event of the season. Footmen in elaborate livery directed the flow of guests while the sound of a full orchestra drifted from the ballroom. "Remember," the Duke said as they prepared to alight, "you are here as my equal and partner, not as my protégé. Let no one suggest otherwise." Eleanor nodded, gathering her courage, as she had learned to do in moments of crisis. The transformation from servant to lady was about to face its ultimate test. The receiving line moved with practiced efficiency, and Eleanor found herself face to face with Lord Pemberton sooner than expected. His greeting was warm and public, clearly intended to signal his approval to the assembled guests. "Miss Whitmore," he said, taking her gloved hand, "you look absolutely radiant this evening. I've been telling everyone about your remarkable insights into those Austrian documents." "You're too kind, my lord," Eleanor replied, but she could feel the ripple of interest her presence had created among the nearby guests. Conversations paused as curious eyes assessed this unknown woman who had somehow earned Lord Pemberton's public endorsement. Viscount Ashford appeared at her elbow as if summoned by magic, resplendent in his evening clothes and wearing an expression of genuine pleasure. "Miss Whitmore, you've exceeded even my considerable expectations. That gown is magnificent, but it pales beside the intelligence in your eyes." Eleanor felt a flutter of warmth at his words, but before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the pleasant atmosphere like a blade. "Well, well, if it isn't the famous Miss Whitmore." Eleanor turned to find Sterling Blackwood approaching, flanked by two companions she didn't recognize. Sterling himself looked haggard despite his expensive evening clothes. His golden hair had lost some of its luster, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and bitter thoughts. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor replied evenly, refusing to let him see any sign of intimidation. "I'm surprised to see you here. I understood you were indisposed." Sterling's smile was sharp as a razor. "Oh, my dear girl, did you think a temporary setback would keep me away from such a momentous occasion? After all, it's not every day that a servant girl attempts to crash the highest levels of society." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor could feel the attention of nearby guests focusing on their exchange. This was exactly what Sterling had hoped for, a public confrontation that would force her to defend her position and potentially expose her to ridicule. But Eleanor had learned much about strategy in her months as the Duke's secretary. Instead of rising to the bait, she smiled with genuine amusement. "How fascinating that you still think of me as a servant, Mr. Blackwood. I suppose it must be difficult to adjust one's perspective when one's own position has become so uncertain." The barb hit home, and Sterling's face flushed with anger. "My position is perfectly secure, I assure you. Unlike some people, I don't need to rely on charity and pity to maintain my place in society." "Charity?" Viscount Ashford's voice was deceptively mild, but Eleanor could hear the steel beneath the silk. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Blackwood. Miss Whitmore's position is based entirely on merit. Her linguistic abilities and analytical skills have proven invaluable to British interests." One of Sterling's companions, a thin man with calculating eyes, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Linguistic abilities? How unusual for a woman of her background. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, where exactly did you acquire such exotic accomplishments?" Eleanor recognized the trap immediately. The question was designed to force her to either lie about her humble origins or admit to them in a way that would diminish her credibility. But she had learned that the truth, properly presented, could be more powerful than any deception. "My father was a scholar before his death," she replied calmly. "He believed that knowledge was the one inheritance that could never be stolen or squandered. I've simply tried to honor his memory by making the most of the gifts he gave me." The answer was perfectly pitched. It acknowledged her modest background while emphasizing the nobility of learning and the importance of honoring one's parents. Several nearby guests nodded approvingly, and Eleanor could see Sterling's frustration growing. "How touching," Sterling sneered. "And I suppose your father also taught you to eavesdrop on private conversations and betray the trust of your betters." The accusation was serious enough to demand a response, and Eleanor could feel the weight of expectation from the assembled guests. This was the moment Sterling had been building toward, the chance to publicly question her integrity and force her to defend actions that could be interpreted as dishonorable. But before Eleanor could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "I'm afraid you're quite mistaken, Mr. Blackwood." Everyone turned to see Lord Pemberton himself approaching, his expression grave but determined. Behind him walked a distinguished gentleman Eleanor didn't recognize, wearing the unmistakable bearing of high government office. Miss Whitmore's actions in exposing the European Consortium's conspiracy have been thoroughly investigated by the appropriate authorities, Lord Pemberton continued. Far from betraying anyone's trust, she demonstrated exactly the kind of loyalty and courage that this nation values most highly. The unknown gentleman stepped forward with a slight bow. "Allow me to introduce myself, Miss Whitmore. Sir Charles Whitehall, Foreign Office. I've had the pleasure of reviewing your translations of the Austrian correspondence, and I must say they represent some of the finest analytical work I've encountered in 20 years of diplomatic service." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just social acceptance. This was official recognition from the highest levels of government. Sir Charles's presence and public endorsement would make it virtually impossible for anyone to question her legitimacy. "You're too kind, Sir Charles," Eleanor replied, though her mind was racing with the implications. "I simply applied the skills my father taught me to serve my country's interests." "Indeed," Sir Charles agreed, "and it's precisely that combination of skill and patriotism that has led to a rather extraordinary opportunity. Miss Whitmore, would you be interested in serving as a special consultant to the Foreign Office? Your linguistic abilities and analytical insights could prove invaluable in our ongoing negotiations with various European powers." The offer hung in the air like a golden thread, promising not just social acceptance, but professional recognition at the highest levels of government. Eleanor could feel the shock rippling through the assembled guests. This was unprecedented, a servant girl being offered a position that would place her among the most influential advisors in the realm. Sterling's face had gone white with rage and disbelief. "This is preposterous. You're going to trust state secrets to a woman who was cleaning floors 6 months ago? I'm going to trust them to a woman who has already proven her worth," Sir Charles replied coldly. "Unlike some people, Miss Whitmore has demonstrated that her loyalty cannot be purchased or compromised." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Sterling's companions began to edge away from him as they realized the direction the conversation was taking. Eleanor could see the moment when Sterling understood that his public attack had backfired spectacularly. "Miss Whitmore," Viscount Ashford said quietly, "I believe this calls for a celebration. Would you honor me with that dance we discussed?" Eleanor accepted his offered arm gratefully, allowing him to lead her away from the confrontation and onto the ballroom floor. As they took their positions for a waltz, she could feel hundreds of eyes following their movement, but for the first time the attention felt supportive rather than hostile. "That was masterfully handled," the Viscount murmured as they began to dance. "You turned Sterling's attack into a triumph." I had excellent allies," Eleanor replied, allowing herself to enjoy the sensation of dancing with a man who treated her as an equal, "though I suspect this evening is far from over." "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but you've already won the most important battle. Society has accepted you not because of your birth, but because of your worth. That's a victory that can never be taken away." As they moved across the dance floor, Eleanor caught sight of the Duke watching from the sidelines, his expression filled with pride and satisfaction. Near him stood James Hartwell, who had arrived late but whose presence added another layer of support to her growing circle of allies. But it was the sight of Sterling retreating from the ballroom, his face dark with humiliation and rage, that reminded Eleanor that her victory tonight had come at a cost. She had made an enemy who would never forgive or forget, and whose desire for revenge would only grow stronger with time. "Viscount Ashford," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you truly believe that society is ready to accept such dramatic changes? Or are we simply witnessing a temporary aberration that will be corrected once the novelty wears off?" He considered her question seriously as they continued to dance. "I believe that society changes one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one dance at a time. Tonight, you've shown hundreds of influential people that intelligence and character matter more than bloodlines. Some of them will resist that lesson, but others will embrace it. And those who embrace it will help create a world where merit truly matters. Eleanor felt a surge of hope at his words, but also a growing awareness of the responsibility that came with her new position. She was no longer just fighting for her own advancement. She had become a symbol of change itself, and the choices she made would affect others who might follow in her footsteps. As the waltz came to an end, Sir Charles appeared at her elbow with a small group of distinguished gentlemen in tow. "Miss Whitmore, if you have a moment, there are several colleagues I'd like you to meet. We have some rather urgent matters that could benefit from your expertise." Eleanor glanced at Viscount Ashford, who nodded encouragingly. "Go," he said softly. "This is your moment. Seize it with both hands." As she allowed Sir Charles to lead her toward what was clearly going to be an impromptu diplomatic consultation, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, overlooked, dismissed as insignificant. Tonight, she was being courted by the highest levels of government and society. But with great opportunity came great risk, and Eleanor knew that the enemies she had made would not simply disappear. Sterling's humiliation tonight would only fuel his desire for revenge, and there would be others who saw her success as a threat to their own positions. The question was no longer whether she could rise above her humble origins. She had already proven that. The question now was whether she could maintain her position in the face of the challenges that lay ahead, and whether she could use her influence to help others who might follow in her footsteps. As she prepared to enter the next phase of her remarkable transformation, Eleanor Whitmore knew that her greatest adventures were still to come. 6 months after the Pemberton Ball, Eleanor stood at the window of her new office in Whitehall, watching the bustling streets of London come alive in the early morning light. The brass nameplate on her door read, "Miss E. Whitmore, Senior Linguistic Consultant," but the title barely captured the scope of her influence within the Foreign Office. Her translations and analyses had helped prevent 2 potential trade wars, exposed 3 separate espionage attempts, and facilitated negotiations that had strengthened Britain's position across Europe. The office itself reflected her remarkable journey, elegant but functional, with maps of Europe covering one wall and shelves lined with dictionaries in a dozen languages. Her desk, a magnificent mahogany piece that had once belonged to a former foreign secretary, was organized with the same precision she had brought to her work at Thornfield Manor, though the documents she now handled could influence the fate of nations. A soft knock at the door interrupted her morning reflections. "Come in," she called, turning from the window with a smile as James Hartwell entered, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of barely contained excitement that she had come to associate with significant developments. "Eleanor," he said, setting the portfolio on her desk, "I have news that I think will interest you greatly. The Duke has just received confirmation that the new shipping routes through the Mediterranean are performing beyond all expectations. The profits from the past quarter alone have exceeded our most optimistic projections." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction. The trade agreements she had helped negotiate, using her linguistic skills to navigate the complex diplomatic landscape of European commerce, had transformed the Duke's business from a struggling enterprise into one of the most successful shipping operations in Britain. "That's wonderful news," she replied, though she could see from James's expression that there was more to come. "But I suspect that's not the only reason for your visit this morning." James smiled, his hazel eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "You know me too well. Actually, I've come with a proposal that I hope you'll find intriguing." Before Eleanor could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This time it was Viscount Ashford who entered, looking every inch the successful diplomat in his perfectly tailored morning coat. Over the past months, their professional relationship had deepened into something far more personal. though both had been careful to maintain propriety given the scrutiny that surrounded Eleanor's position. "Miss Whitmore," he said with a formal bow that didn't quite hide the warmth in his dark eyes. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, my lord," Eleanor replied, though she could feel the familiar flutter of excitement that his presence always brought. "Mr. Hartwell was just about to share some news with me." "Actually," James said, glancing between them with obvious amusement, "I think Lord Ashford's news might be more significant than mine. After all, it's not every day that a man receives a posting to the embassy in Vienna." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she turned to study Viscount Ashford's face. "Vienna. The Foreign Secretary has asked me to serve as the new commercial attaché," he confirmed, his expression carefully neutral. "It's a significant promotion, and the position would allow me to work closely with the Austrian government on the very trade agreements you've been analyzing." Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in his advancement, excitement about the opportunities such a position would create, and a sharp pang of loss at the thought of his departure. "Congratulations, my lord. It's a well-deserved recognition of your abilities." "Thank you," he replied, then paused, his formal demeanor giving way to something more vulnerable. "Eleanor, there's something else. The position comes with a rather substantial residence and the expectation that the attaché will eventually take a wife who can serve as hostess for diplomatic functions." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor could feel her pulse racing as she realized what he was suggesting, but years of caution made her hesitate to assume too much. "That sounds like a significant responsibility," she said carefully. James cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should leave you two to discuss this privately." "No," Viscount Ashford said quickly. "Actually, your presence is quite appropriate, Mr. Hartwell. You see, the position in Vienna would also require someone with exceptional linguistic skills to handle correspondence and negotiations with multiple European governments, someone who understands not just the languages, but the cultural nuances that can make or break diplomatic relationships." Eleanor's breath caught as the full scope of what he was proposing became clear. "You're suggesting a professional partnership." "I'm suggesting much more than that," he replied, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. "Eleanor, these past months have shown me that you're not just the most intelligent woman I've ever met, but also the bravest, the most principled, and the most remarkable person I've had the privilege to know. I'm asking you to marry me, not just because I love you desperately, but because together we could accomplish things that neither of us could achieve alone." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as the magnitude of his proposal sank in. Marriage to Viscount Ashford would not only fulfill her deepest personal desires, but would also provide her with a platform to influence international relations at the highest levels. It was an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams. "Edward," she said softly, using his given name for the first time, "are you certain? Marriage to me would mean accepting a wife whose background will always be scrutinized, whose every action will be measured against expectations of what a diplomat's wife should be." "Eleanor," he replied, his voice filled with conviction, "you've already redefined what a diplomat's wife can be. Your intelligence, your integrity, your ability to see through deception and find truth, these are exactly the qualities that our changing world demands." James, who had been watching this exchange with obvious delight, suddenly straightened as if remembering something important. "Actually, this brings me back to my own news. Eleanor, the Duke has asked me to propose something that might influence your decision." Eleanor turned to him, still holding Edward's hands, her mind reeling from the rapid succession of momentous developments. "The Duke wants to establish a new foundation," James continued, "dedicated to providing education and opportunities for young people of exceptional ability, regardless of their social background. He's asked if you would consider serving as its director, with full authority to develop programs that could help others follow the path you've blazed." Eleanor felt as though the world was spinning around her. In the space of a few minutes, she had been offered marriage to the man she loved, a diplomatic career that would utilize all her abilities, and the chance to help others overcome the barriers she had faced. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that's extraordinary. But how could I manage such a responsibility while living in Vienna? "Actually," Edward interjected, "the foundation could have international scope. Vienna is perfectly positioned to identify and assist talented young people from across Europe. We could work together to create opportunities that transcend national boundaries." Eleanor looked between the two men who had become so important to her life, seeing in their faces the same excitement and possibility that was building in her own heart. But even as hope soared within her, a shadow of concern remained. "What about Sterling?" she asked quietly. "He's never forgiven me for his downfall, and marriage to a viscount would only increase his resentment. I won't have my happiness built on the foundation of someone else's destruction." Edward's expression grew serious. "Sterling has made his own choices, Eleanor. His bitterness and desire for revenge are his responsibility, not yours. You can't allow his failures to limit your success. Besides," James added, "Sterling's influence has waned considerably since the consortium scandal. His father has cut off his allowance, and he's been forced to take a position with a minor trading company in Liverpool. He's no longer in a position to threaten anyone." Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't quite shake the feeling that Sterling's story wasn't finished. Men like him didn't simply accept defeat and fade away. They nursed their grievances and waited for opportunities to strike back. But as she looked at Edward's hopeful face and considered the extraordinary future he was offering, Eleanor realized that she couldn't allow fear of what might happen to prevent her from embracing what could be. She had already proven that courage and intelligence could triumph over prejudice and conspiracy. Now it was time to prove that love and partnership could create something even more powerful. "Edward," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes. Yes to marriage. Yes to Vienna. Yes to building a life together that honors both our abilities and our values." The joy that lit up his face was worth every risk she was taking. As he swept her into his arms, spinning her around the office while James applauded, Eleanor felt the last pieces of her transformation falling into place. 3 hours later, Eleanor found herself in the Duke's study at Thornfield Manor, the same room where her journey had begun with Sterling's accusations and the consortium's threats. But now the space felt entirely different. Warm, welcoming, filled with the promise of new beginnings rather than the shadow of old betrayals. "My dear Eleanor," the Duke said, raising a glass of champagne in toast, "I cannot adequately express how proud I am of what you've accomplished. When I first offered you the position as my secretary, I knew you were intelligent and capable, but I never imagined that you would rise to such heights or achieve such influence." Eleanor smiled, accepting her own glass and feeling the weight of the engagement ring that now graced her finger, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to Edward's grandmother. "Your Grace, none of this would have been possible without your faith in me. You gave me the chance to prove myself when no one else would have considered it. And you seized that chance with both hands," he replied. "But more than that, you've used your success to help others. The foundation we're establishing will ensure that other young people with exceptional abilities won't have to wait for chance encounters to discover their potential." James, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward with a document in his hand. "Speaking of the foundation, I have the preliminary charter here for your review. We've tentatively named it the Whitmore Institute for Educational Excellence." Eleanor's eyes widened as she read the name. "You want to name it after me?" "Who else?" the Duke asked with a smile. "You've proven that intelligence and character matter more than bloodlines. It's fitting that an institution dedicated to those principles should bear your name." As Eleanor reviewed the charter, she was struck by the scope of what they were proposing. The institute would provide scholarships, language training, cultural education, and professional mentorship to young people from all backgrounds. It would have branches in London, Vienna, and eventually other European capitals, creating a network of opportunity that could transform countless lives. "This is remarkable," she said, looking up from the document. "But are you certain about the international scope? It's ambitious almost, to the point of being overwhelming." "Eleanor," Edward said, moving to stand beside her, "you've already proven that ambitious goals are achievable when pursued with intelligence and determination. Besides, you won't be working alone. We'll build a team of dedicated professionals who share our vision." Eleanor nodded, feeling the truth of his words. She had learned that the most meaningful accomplishments were rarely achieved in isolation. They required partnerships, alliances, and the support of people who believed in the same principles. A soft knock at the door interrupted their planning session, and Mrs. Pemberton entered with a silver tray bearing a telegram. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but this just arrived for Miss Whitmore. The messenger said it was urgent." Eleanor accepted the telegram with a slight frown, wondering who would be sending her urgent communications at Thornfield Manor. As she read the message, her expression grew troubled. "What is it?" Edward asked, noting her concern. Eleanor looked up from the telegram, her mind already working through the implications of what she had just read. "It's from Sir Charles at the Foreign Office. There's been a development in Vienna. Apparently, someone has been spreading rumors about my background and qualifications among the Austrian diplomatic community. The rumors are detailed enough to suggest inside knowledge of my history." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Someone with intimate knowledge of Eleanor's past was actively working to undermine her future, and the timing suggested a deliberate attempt to sabotage her engagement and upcoming diplomatic career. "Sterling," James said grimly. "It has to be. He's the only one with both the knowledge and the motivation to orchestrate something like this." Eleanor nodded, though part of her had hoped that Sterling had finally accepted defeat and moved on with his life. "The question is, what do we do about it? If these rumors take hold in Vienna, they could destroy Edward's career as well as mine." Edward's expression hardened with determination. "We fight back. We present the truth so clearly and convincingly that no reasonable person could doubt your qualifications or character. And we do it together," the Duke added firmly. "Sterling may think he's found a way to strike back, but he's underestimated the strength of the alliances you've built, Eleanor. You're no longer the isolated servant girl he tried to frame months ago. You're a respected professional with powerful friends and proven accomplishments." Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for the support surrounding her, but also a steely determination to face this new challenge head-on. Sterling's latest attack was more sophisticated than his previous attempts, but it was also more desperate. He was striking out from a position of weakness, trying to destroy what he could no longer hope to possess. "Then we go to Vienna," she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "We present ourselves honestly and openly, and we let our work speak for itself. If Sterling wants a final confrontation, then he'll have one. But this time he'll discover that I'm no longer fighting alone." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Thornfield Manor, Eleanor Whitmore looked around at the faces of the people who had become her chosen family. The Duke, who had given her a chance, James, who had become her trusted friend, and Edward, who had offered her his heart and his future. Together, they represented something powerful. The possibility that merit could triumph over prejudice, that love could overcome social barriers, and that courage could create lasting change. The battle with Sterling was far from over, but Eleanor faced it with confidence born of experience and strength drawn from the bonds she had forged. She had already proven that a humble servant could become a respected professional. Now she would prove that a woman of principle could build a legacy that would outlast any attempt to destroy it. The future stretched before her, bright with possibility and rich with purpose. And Eleanor Whitmore was ready to embrace it all. If you've been captivated by Eleanor's incredible journey from servant to diplomat, from invisible to indispensable, then this story has found its mark. Her transformation reminds us that true nobility comes not from bloodlines, but from the courage to stand for what's right, and the intelligence to see opportunities where others see only obstacles. Eleanor's story proves that no matter how humble our beginnings, we all have the power to rewrite our destinies through determination, integrity, and the willingness to help others along the way. Her linguistic gifts opened doors, but it was her character that kept them open. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories of remarkable people who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them. Like this video if Eleanor's journey inspired you, and share in the comments which part of her transformation resonated most deeply with your own dreams and aspirations. Remember, every great change begins with someone brave enough to take the first step, just as Eleanor did on that fateful day when she chose to speak truth to power in 9 different languages.